de los Floridos, um, both both of these being kind of, somewhat, I don't want to, middle brow or middle prestige might be the better term, organizations among the Hispanophone communities of the Low Countries for passing out prizes for poetry. But he styled himself, this is certain, he styled himself primarily a poet, right? Also a merchant, right? And we know from the autobiographical elements of the Confusión de los Confusiones, that de las Confusiones, that he became wealthy and was probably impoverished over several cycles of boom and bust in his life, so that by 1688 he decided to write a dialogue about the stock market. So what are his chops in philosophy? Well, probably just what he was able to get from being a learned and competent user of Hebrew and Spanish and Dutch. But again, somewhat like Spinoza. Spinoza is an interesting contrast case, someone to speculate through, someone who had a tight relationship to the Sephardic community, and through this had his initial primary education. All right, so that's pretty much all I wanted to say in terms of biography. More will come up as I go on concerning the role of the Sephardic community in finance, and in particular in the stock exchange in Amsterdam in the 17th century. But I think I can bracket that for now. Let me just highlight perhaps a few of the important moments here. Again, we presume that that De la Vega was born around 1650, so almost a half century after the foundation of the Dutch East India Company, and 44 years after the first occurrence of the term actia, which is Dutch for share. I don't know what modern Dutch is. In French today, it's still action. First occurrence of the term share, and the opening up of the public trading in the company and then it was in 1611. I didn't put this on the timeline. It was in 1611 that they opened the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, that this is an image of from some Dutch master's painting. And it stayed the center of the Dutch Stock Exchange for quite some time. Incidentally, I think it was 2011 only that the Brussels, Amsterdam, and Paris stock exchanges all got fused into what they now call Euronext, which was, among other things, the sad final nail in the coffin of the glory days of the Amsterdam exchange, which is where pretty much everything started, right, including the New York Stock Exchange. All right, so that's all I want to say about biography and related matters. Now, as I was saying before that digression, generally De la Vega, when he's mentioned at all, he's mentioned by economic historians and not by philosophers. This has influenced the channels through which his work has been translated into English. And I guess, as far as I know, we have an abridged English translation. Let me show that. We have an abridged English translation. We have a Dutch translation of the Spanish, which is published only in 1939. And in 1919, we have a complete German translation. As far as I know, this is all that exists, though I could be mistaken and something else could turn up. The English translation of 1957, I am confident in saying, is terrible. It's unusable for scholarly purposes. Again, the priorities that have been brought to bear, and the reason why I feel confident in that rather extreme judgment, the priorities that have been brought to bear in the small number of editions of his work that have come out in the mid-20th century have reflected the priorities of economic historians. Thus, Arthur H. Cole, a mid-century business historian at Harvard, writes in his foreword to the 1957 abridged English translation, let me read this, I think it's really striking, to translate the whole text of the book into English did not appear appropriate. The diffuseness of the author and the profusion of his rhetorical excursions, which not only would make the matter tedious to the modern reader, but also would raise particular difficulties in the translation of numerous passages, seemed to dictate some simplification. In the end, only those sections that were translated which give to the volume continuing importance for business and economic historians. He just says it right out, namely the portions concerned pretty directly with the affairs of the stock exchange. So what Cole is calling his profuseness and the matters that are tedious to the modern reader, it turns out, are often engagements with philosophical problems, right? So the reason why we take this to be a work merely of interest to economic historians is because of a conscious decision of abridgment in the mid-20th century. So this is a rare case where, you know, we're dealing with a historical figure who can be salvaged and the record can be set straight. This is a case of what Eric Schließer would call neglect, right? All right. So again, the result is not just abridgment, but in many cases, rather egregious anachronism, such as, notably, the interpolation of the English terms bull and bear to translate de la Vega's Liefheberen and contraminores, respectively. The former terms, bull and bear, appear first in Thomas Mortimer's 1769 work, Every Man His Own Broker, which I have not read, but it sounds like a kind of curious instance of 18th century personal investment guide, which might be revelatory in certain ways. While the terms de la Vega uses, the one meaning lover, that is Liefheber, in Flemish, and the other meaning against the mines in pseudo-Latin, are of the author's own coinage. So the lovers, the Liefheberen, start their operations by purchases, de la Vega writes, just as if they were lovers of the country, of the state, and of the company, that is to say, the Dutch East India Company. The contraminores are so named since, as he writes, and I don't quite understand what he means by this, India is considered to be a mine. This faction strives to exhaust the mine. That doesn't, I forget what the Spanish is. I'm sorry, I should not have just left it in translation, but I don't understand if that's taken to mean that they want to deplete the resources of the Indies, in which case that doesn't sound exactly bearish to me. In any case,
we lost your audio for a second. So
oh, okay, I'm glad. Okay, oh goodness, I don't know why my connection is unstable. Hold on, let me plug in case there are any problems. So I don't quite understand De la Vega's own explanation of the meaning of contra minores to mean what the English abridged edition anachronistically calls the bulls or bullish speculators. And this is characteristic of this work. There's a lot of stuff that, again, maybe because my reading knowledge of Spanish is not particularly nuanced, or maybe because these are just references I haven't fully grasped yet. I don't get what De la Vega is saying some of the time, and so I need help. And this is a good example of that. So there is, in any case, much more going on in this work than can easily be appreciated from the perspective of a 20th century business school professor. And one may ask on what grounds it has been received as principally of interest to economic historians, what grounds other than the history of abridgment and addition. De la Vega does not seem, alas, prima facie, to have much, one striking feature of this work that is worth noting at the outset is that the dialogue includes a philosopher character, the philosopher. It also includes the stockholder, el accionista, and it includes el mercador, the merchant. So these are the three characters. The merchant, I have not quite figured out what his role is. It seems to be rather tertiary. The accionista seems to me to be really leading the show. He's the one in charge. He's the Socrates of this dialogue. He's the one that's setting the other two straight. As for the philosopher, he does not seem to have much philosophical insight to provide. He's not a fool, as philosophers were often depicted in period comedy, right? And you can cite, for example, Molière's Le Misanthrope, where you have a scholastic philosopher who is just, the ultimate buffoon who doesn't understand anything that's going on. Our philosopher in this dialogue often doesn't understand things, but the emphasis seems to be on the inability of anyone with a good head on their shoulders to understand these wild new phenomena that are taking place on the stock market, right? So the philosopher is depicted as a fairly standard model scholastic, as in Molière, with a deep reserve of knowledge of syllogisms and of fixed phrases in Latin. And he drops a lot of Latin, suggesting erudition without real wisdom. That seems to be the purpose of it. He cites Aristotle, Cicero, Pliny, Galen, Tertullian, Athenaeus, a lot of figures who seem to me to be kind of standard repertoire, you might say. But he also cites a number of poets, including Ovid, whose metamorphoses seem to prefigure the vacillations of the stock market in ways that the accionista is happy to run with. The philosopher leaves it to the accionista to quote Cervantes, to quote Don Quixote, which is one of the few contemporary references in the book, and which shows the shareholder to be the one who's relatively more with it as far as reading habits go. It appears, in fact, that the contrast between the shareholder and the philosopher is meant to highlight an ironic twist of the modern era, that investors in the Dutch East India Company are better positioned to philosophize than are schoolboys who have memorized their syllogistic forms, right? And this is, I think, a fairly, it's not exactly a trope of early modern philosophy, but it's certainly an idea that drives the so-called novatores, right? Foremost among them, René Descartes, right? The rejection of the pretenses of book learning in favor of kind of using your own mind in the case of Descartes, but that also becomes, in the case of people like Leibniz, being prepared to, get with the new, right? To jump on the latest trends. And that is a contrast between the personages of the stock shareholder and the philosopher that, kind of juxtaposes in certain respects the ancients and the moderns, right? So thus, early in the work, the philosopher, but again, the philosopher often makes interesting points. For example, early in the work, the philosopher asks, and what kind of business is this about? Which I have often heard people talk, but which I neither understand nor have ever made efforts to comprehend. And the shareholder replies, and this is a long passage, I really must say that you are an ignorant person, my bearded friend. So, again, the stereotype, I mean, this is an ancient stereotype that, that he's happy to draw on almost for the sake of caricature. The majority of 17th century philosophers were not bearded. My bearded friend, if you know nothing of this, you're an ignorant person if you know nothing of this enigmatic business, which is at once the fairest and most deceitful in Europe, the ablest and the most infamous in the world, the finest and the most vulgar on earth. It is a quintessence of academic learning and a paragon of fraudulence. It is a touchstone for the intelligent and a tombstone for the audacious, a treasury of usefulness and a source of disaster, and finally a counterpart of Sisyphus, who never rests, as also of Ixion, who is chained to a wheel that turns perpetually. You almost get the sense of a kind of dialectical thinking here, but it's not so much dialectical as you might say flattening, right? The idea is to say that this contains its opposites and in that respect flattens out to nothing, right? But we'll get to that soon enough. The philosopher then complains, and this is really interesting. The philosopher then complains that there was no mention of this sort of actions that El Accionista wants to talk about. There was no mention of this sort of actions in the Praedicamenta of Aristotle, that is the categories, one of which is action, right? So consciously playing on the polysemy of the word action that is a product of transformations in the 17th century. So the philosopher admits that he would like to try his hand at investing, but hesitates, comparing the stock market to a ship to which every wind means a storm. He goes on to complain that, and I quote, with my limited capital, I could win only if I were willing to renounce my reputation frivolously. Preoccupation with this business seems to me unworthy of a philosopher, and furthermore, since everyone knows the humble character of my surroundings, there would be nobody to give me credit and to have confidence in my beard, right? And this is obviously, again, contrasting caricatures, but having to contend, you might say, with the old model of the philosopher as a world renouncer and the model represented paradigmatically by someone like Leibniz, who is, among other things, out to make a buck. As Matthew Stewart, in his somewhat insulting bestseller, The Courtier and the Heretic, portrays Spinoza and Leibniz. Spinoza is the world renouncer representing ancient values, and Leibniz is the sellout. Again, the nice thing in De la Vega is you've got both of these figures in a single dialogue. So from early on, again, the philosopher is the voice both of useless erudition and of naivete. But this is meant not so much to highlight the philosopher's own intellectual limits as to draw out the various respects in which the market operates in counterintuitive ways, in ways that seem paradoxical, as in the list of opposites in the quote that I just read to you. Indeed, in ways that seem to violate some of the most fundamental laws of thought and of nature. It seems, for example, the philosopher notes, incompatible with philosophy that the Liefhebberen, again, the bullish speculators, should sell, he writes, after the reason for their sales has ceased to exist. Since the philosophers, the philosopher says, teach that when the cause ceases, the effect ceases also. But if the Liefhebberen obstinately go on selling, there is an effect after the cause has disappeared. Moreover, he goes on, while philosophy teaches that different effects are ascribable to different causes, at the stock exchange, some buy and some sell on the basis of a given piece of news, so that here one cause has different effects. So that might look like that the final observation, and I forget whether I wrote that quote out. No, I didn't, I'm sorry. Oops, no, sorry. Sorry, I forgot, I lost some track of my citations. That last line, that some buy and some sell on the basis of a given piece of news, so that here one cause has different effects, that might look like just a recognition of, let's say, epistemic uncertainty as to the way things are going to turn out. Different people are relying on different information or a different understanding of how things work. So one person thinks that such and such ship is going to come back with a lot of silver on it. Another thinks it's going to get wrecked in the Sargasso Sea or something like that. So they behave differently. I think there's something more to this that's going to become an important theme in the remaining part of my talk, that different people some buy and some sell on the basis of a given piece of news, so that here one cause has different effects. This isn't just a matter of epistemic uncertainty. It's a matter of operating with different financial instruments. Again, or in particular, financial instruments that we think of as derivative and as the turf of speculators, such as shorts, right? Where you get rich by the stock going down, for example. So that is what De la Vega is most interested in this text. And that's what leads to all these paradoxical forms of behavior, like buying and selling, but variously buying or selling based on exactly the same information. But we'll develop that further momentarily. Sometimes the philosopher seems to bring philosophy needlessly into overwrought comparisons, as when he says that, as for the stock exchange, I approve the paradoxical opinion of the Platonic musician that the non-existent is better than the existent. And I don't know what that's a reference to. I probably could have checked up on it had I had the time. Maybe Zoli will tell us. This in the course of proposing the rather moderate conclusion that it's not the entire stock market that needs to be abolished, but only speculation, the philosopher says, not the honest business in shares, for what is fair in the latter, in the honest business in shares, is dubious in the former, in speculation. So I think for the remainder, most of the remainder, we're going to talk about this distinction and what we can learn about De la Vega's, broadly speaking, philosophical project from it. One of the leitmotifs of the work is that the stock market has not so much discovered as it has rather conjured into existence specter-like entities that it would have been better not to let out. It has, in effect, summoned demons. This is significant as a trope, anticipating Marx's love of the supernatural as a means of ridiculing capitalists, but also as one of the sites of the reappearance in an era in which natural philosophy was generally keen on eradicating them of immaterial forces. To buy a share of a Dutch East India Company ship is, at least we can begin from here, to buy a share of a Dutch East India ship is an honest endeavor, relying on a mathematics of fractions common since antiquity. But the sundry derivative financial instruments that had emerged in Amsterdam in the 17th century seemed to show that value could be conjured ex nihilo by efforts, for example, to short the market, where a speculator gains money by gambling on the decrease in value of a given commodity. In grasping for examples of similar practices that pre-exist these burgeoning signs of the coming era of finance capitalism, the one that seemed most amenable to De la Vega, was conjuration. De la Vega always strikes a careful balance between condemnation and fascination. And in part, it's the dialogue form that enables him to keep the reader guessing as to his own deepest commitments. This is most clear in the case of speculative inventions, such as so-called ducaton shares, which have been described as imaginary or fictitious units of exchange by economic historians, and were often said to be a speciality among members of the Portuguese nation, as they called them, which is to say Sephardic Jews in the Low Countries. As far as I can tell, and I again, here I'm reading the secondary literature, but I'm also reading De la Vega's description. As far as I can tell from De la Vega's own description, ducaton shares are not imaginary, but rather arbitrarily small units of stock that are sold in large numbers by speculators to people who would otherwise be excluded from investing, thus combining features both of so-called penny stocks, but also of things like the numbers rackets that would emerge in the 19th and 20th centuries, in which what is a de facto a sort of lottery is, at least in some of its instances, pegged to the daily stock market results. Incidentally, as Stephen Stigler discusses beautifully in his remarkable book, Casanova's Lottery, which I think is still forthcoming. I had the pleasure of being able to review it for University of Chicago Press. In Stephen Stigler's book, Casanova's Lottery, he explains that he explains wonderfully how numbers games have always been accompanied by numerology. That is, by superstitious practices aimed at learning the right numbers in a way that defies, let us say, the causal asymmetry between the past and the future. And lotteries and stock markets, in turn, seem in significant respects to be twinned in their historical development. They emerge, and Stigler confirms this, they emerge at roughly the same time, both relying on and strengthening new ideas about the public benefit of diffused risk-taking. And both are shaped by the new techniques of probability, which for its part emerges out of the practical need to insure ships and things like ships, but soon enough takes on the character of an epistemological revolution and even a transformed model of reality in which everything is financialized. Today, you can invest in derivative financial instruments that will reward you if there is, say, an earthquake in Anatolia in the coming year, and you can find investment strategists who will offer reasons why the availability of such instruments keep more people more prosperous and safer. De la Vega is just beginning to see the endless possibilities of such creativity, and again appears neither prepared to condemn it, nor to take the tone of a hedge fund manager who at least tries to speak as if the endeavor were morally neutral. A principal concern of the work, in fact, seems to be a sort of effort to speak from a position of eternal wisdom, where all this endeavor equals out to nothing in the end, both morally, because the good that can be done with the wealth generated is balanced by the rapacity of the wealth hunting it requires, as well as for a person's individual finance, since people are both made and ruined in equal measure. And finally, it all comes to nothing for De la Vega in the sense taught by the memento mori theme in, among other traditions, the paintings of the Dutch masters. One might detect here too, this is somewhat speculative, but one might detect here too, a sort of demotic expression of a certain precept of the new mechanical physics that may already have been making the rounds, as De la Vega wrote, namely that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. After all, Newton's Principia Mathematica had appeared just 1 year before the Conclusion. More generally, though, whether or not he is keeping up with theoretical physics, De la Vega is convinced that the stock market is a suitable allegory for the world itself, and to this extent, it cannot be entirely evil, even if its principal character seems to be folly. As to the Ducaton trade, to get back to that for a moment, De la Vega notes that this branch of trade has been increasing during the last 5 years, so from 1683 to 1688, to such an extent, and mainly with a certain group which is as boisterous as it is quick-witted, that it is engaged in by both sexes, old men, women, and children. Therefore, the means devised to reduce hazard has in fact made the dangers more widespread. The speculators believe in vain that through abandoning the business in large shares, they can avoid their irrevocable destiny and can free themselves from the fetters of gambling in stocks. But they will discover that by engaging in the trade of Ducaton shares, they just prolong their agony. Now, a further comment that De la Vega makes gives a significant glimpse into the numbers racket character of this trade. On weekdays, he writes, the settlement for the Ducaton trade is made in the exchange building. On Sundays and holidays, it's made in the main street. So that's an important cue. Here, I'm reminded of the enthusiasm with which I was checking up until a few weeks ago my Coinbase account to see how my Bitcoin was doing on Sunday mornings or late at night when my Dow Jones ticker was resting quietly, which maybe tells us something about the nature of crypto. A good number of the issues that De la Vega addresses are particular to his place and time, unlike the Ducaton share, which seems to be still with us today. For example, the so-called appeal to Frederick, which was named in 1621 for the stadholder Frederick Hendrik, Prince of Orange. By virtue of this rule, a buyer of a short contract could refuse to adhere to the provisions of it. That is to say, as Arthur Cole explains, he could repudiate the agreement and his action would be upheld in courts of law. Cole explains that although there seems to have been dispute in some courts as to the variety of individuals and of business transactions that could properly be included within the protection of the appeal to Frederick, the intent was quite clearly to increase the hazards of speculation. End of quote from Arthur Cole. It's hard for me to see how the buyer's ability to refuse to honor a short contract could make speculating more hazardous rather than less, at least for the buyer. So I'm still not clear on how the appeal to Frederick worked. But what is clear from this and several other such historical curiosities in the work is that from the very beginning of the history of the stock market, opportunists have been looking for ways to game it to their advantage without consideration for the social costs or the public good. And moreover, since the very beginning, there has been a top-down concern not just to regulate, but to find the perfect balance between an anything goes approach at the one extreme and a stifling of individual incentive at the other. Now, the great balancing of the books that De la Vega wishes to convey through allegory, humor, and dialogic polyphony ends up in the end looking a lot like a sort of harmony, to invoke another key philosophical notion of the late 17th century, often associated with a figure I believe we'll be hearing more about in the next talk. And here it seems to me that it would be worthwhile to reconsider briefly the title of De la Vega's strange work, The Confusion of Confusions. Unsurprisingly, earlier scholarship has not picked up on its possible philosophical resonances. In the introduction to the 1957 edition already cited, the one to which Arthur Cole provides the foreword, Eberhard Kellenbenz writes that the confusion of confusions is so called because, as he puts it, I don't have this quote on my slide, sorry. Quote, there was no rational purpose in the activities that was not overlaid with an irrational one, no trick used by one person which others did not pay back with the same coin, so that in this stock exchange business, one moved in a world of darkness which nobody wholly understands, and no pen was able really to describe in all its intricacies. Now, this may all be correct, and it may sound a lot like what De la Vega himself writes, though one still wonders what the purpose was of the redoubling in the title, or indeed perhaps the squaring, the confusion of the confusions. And here it's worth noting that the 17th century saw a number of such redoublings across a wide array of key theoretical insights and scientific discoveries. This will be my final point. Indeed, I see now I'm getting close to an hour already. I didn't think I could do it. Now, take, for example, a field of knowledge not so distant from that of the ship captains employed by the Dutch East India Company, namely the problem of the declination of the magnet. William Gilbert's De Magnete, Magnetisque Corporibus, so on the magnet and on magnetic bodies, is published in 1600, 2 years before the foundation of the company and of the Dutch East India Company. And this is the first work to systematically deal with the problem of the deviation between magnetic north and true north. 35 years later, after we've got the flourishing of those tiny Dutch East India Company's stockholders has turned into a wildly successful open market, 35 years later, in 1635, Henry Gellibrand complicates matters of geomagnetism with his Discourse Mathematical on the Variation of the Magnetical Needle, in which it's brought to the attention of navigators that there's not just a difference between magnetic north and true north in different places on the globe, but that in one and the same place, this difference changes from one moment of measurement to the next. Thus, Gellibrand writes, this I do have as a quote, that which I here principally aim at is the deflection of the needle from the terrestrial meridian, together with that abstruse and admirable variation of the variation lately discovered to the world. So that's the redoubling I wanted to focus on, the variation of the variation. Now, this variation of the variation, incidentally, would preoccupy Leibniz as well, who would propose that the problem of the declination of the needle could ultimately be resolved by a comprehensive collaborative project of periodic measurements at suitably distributed measurement stations across Eurasia. After this, the raw data could be compiled, and the course of magnetic variation could be published in almanacs predictively for the next 2, 3, or 4 years before new data would have to be collected. Leibniz saw this as an instance of discerning the order within the apparent disorder, which was a project whose other principal instances included for him such things as the collection of public health data for the construction of actuarial charts. And finally, in the Leibniz we know best, we have the metaphysical picture of worlds within worlds, another reduct. That is the idea that there is no lower limit to the level of analysis that you might bring to any parcel of nature. You can always go further. So my preliminary conjecture, to start to conclude, is that De la Vega's principal preoccupation, which is reflected in his choice of titles, is with the discovery of a new sort of worlds within worlds, so to speak, in the domain of economics. Namely, the discovery of derivative financial instruments. That is, those that derive their value in response to changes in commodity prices, foreign exchange rates, credit risk, and indices, but in a way that's not directly connected to the commodities themselves. The generic term that was already being used for these in the 17th century is windhandel or windnegotia, which is to say literally the wind trade, a term that emerged in Amsterdam to describe a variety of forms of financial speculation, which was of course regulated to some extent, but even the efforts to contain it reveal its new and epoch-making power. In the natural world, as in the discovery of magnetic variation, just for example, give other examples, we have what the historian of science, Ofer Gal, has somewhat controversially called Baroque science. In metaphysics, as in Leibniz's theory of infinite individual substances containing one another, we have what Gilles Deleuze has similarly identified as a sort of distillation of a Baroque motif most familiar from the visual arts, architecture, and design. So it's not that De la Vega himself discovered these derivative financial instruments, but rather that they emerged out of the cultural historical nexus that generated attention as well to the parallel cases in science and philosophy, and found them worthy of theorization. De la Vega notices that we perceive the future but dimly or confusedly, and that any conduct that relies on a given future outcome is necessarily fraught with confusion. Speculation is thus intrinsically a sort of confusion. But the confusion of confusions is, as in Gellibrand or Leibniz, what we might call a whole nother layer, where the activity of banking on the future, again, something that has existed since antiquity, or indeed perhaps the Neolithic, is something that can be infinitely manipulated by the creation of new abstract instruments with only a remote connection, as remote as you want it to be, to the commodities that traditional speculation was based upon. Joseph de la Vega, on this reading, is both the consummate Baroque economist and also, much like Leibniz, as argued by Jan Elster, a sharp observer and conduit of the emerging spirit of capitalism. So thanks for your attention.
Justin, if you can't hear our questions, just tell us to speak up. We're sitting underneath microphones that are mounted into the ceiling, but depending on
Okay,
sitting,
I can hear you just fine. Can you give me 30 seconds to catch my breath?
you bet. Take your time.
Okay. I'm back. Sorry about that.
We just lost a couple who also took 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, it's
in the meantime, just as an exercise of throat clearing, I just posted in the chat a book, and then I'll do another one. The first one is, and maybe you know it, it's called Against the Gods. It's a mathematical history of sort of the study of risk and sort of the
oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
And the other one is, it's on the English, it's called Casualties of Credit on the English Financial Revolution. So the same historical period, over in England,
Interesting.
but
Yeah.
a couple interesting chapters on the slave trade. So I just
Right.
dumped it
Right.
in the chat,
Yeah. Yeah.
in case
Yeah.
that's any
I
use.
think I read Against the Gods, or at least parts of it, some time ago, whereas the second book is one that has been on my radar, but I've not read.
It's so for me, I had some interesting insights into the relationship between the slave trade and the sort of the developments of financial instruments and how closely those are related.
Mhm.
And then that's by Carl Wennerlin, who's also writes on Hume as a philosopher, but in that book, there's not a lot of reference.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess Hume, I was talking about, when I say early modern, I mean primarily 17th century continental philosophy. And I recognize that Hume scholarship is a lot richer, because no Hume scholar of Hume's philosophy, or for that matter, even of Locke, can really ignore their contributions to the history of thinking of economics.
I have a question, and I may be, I'm very tone deaf about Leibniz, so I may be misunderstanding what the point of the allegory is. But I have a question about the notion of a stock market as an allegory, as it relates to a couple of the basic, the two keynotes that we've had, or we're going to have tonight. Joel K talks about a transference. So there's this process by which economic and monetary practices are somehow transferred, or through the process of transference, into cosmologies and natural scientific accounts of the world.
Yeah.
Richard Seaford uses the language of projection. So there's something about a monetary practice or a social arrangement that becomes projected. You're using the language of the stock market, somehow an allegory. And so I'm curious about this process. I guess one way of asking the question is, how do you make sense of this? And do you think allegorizing is sort of a feature or a function of any society? So we're just, any human society is going to allegorize anyways, so we can read off the allegories what's going on sort of on the ground. Or another interpretation is that no, that's not a function of all human societies, don't necessarily project or transfer, that there's something about financial conditions that will lend itself to allegorizing a philosophical or a scientific worldview. What sense do you?
Well, I spoke of allegory mostly following a couple of works of literature of scholars coming more from, you've got mostly economic historians writing on De la Vega, but the one other discipline that there's a little bit of secondary literature out there from is comparative literature, or broadly speaking, poetics, right? Because he was primarily a poet. Poet merchant. His work is read for its literary qualities, and this is something that that has led to his work being discussed, as typical of Baroque literature. Right. In fact, one very interesting piece says that it's the consummate work of the Jewish Baroque, right? And I don't fully understand all of the implications of that, but it's very interesting nonetheless. So why does De la Vega write about the stock market allegorically? I think here the answer is quite simple, and maybe will be disappointing to you. It's simply that he's a Baroque allegorist, right? He's relying on literary conventions that are available to him and obvious. So his reasons for doing this are characteristic of the kind of work he does, much like a Renaissance painter would represent the four continents through personification or something like that, right? Why does he use this particular allegory? I think here you could say that what he's doing, much like in putting the shareholder and the philosopher in dialogue, he is fusing the old and the new, right? He's relying on conventions of Baroque allegory that any reader of Baroque literature would recognize fairly easily. But he's also inserting something that hasn't been treated in the allegorical form before, right? And the reason for, and you could say, indeed, as the keynotes have mentioned, that this is the beginning of, so to speak, a naturalization or a reification of the system that has emerged in 17th century Amsterdam, so that it will come to appear just as reality itself. And it may be that indeed allegory is an early stage, a prodrome of a kind of holy, kind of convincing world picture, right? But I wouldn't necessarily go that far from De la Vega's own work.
I've got a couple. One sort of narrow question. Beyond the caricature of the philosopher that was in the air at the time, were you able to discern any particular named people from the Middle Ages who left their fingerprints on the text?
No, that's kind of the surprising thing. I've been working recently on Pierre Gassendy's Syntagma Philosophicum, which is a wonderful kind of almost like an early modern Diogenes Laertius sort of doxography. And it's pretty remarkable how it skips from the ancients to like a few pages of medieval figures, and then talks about Francis Bacon, then Descartes, then himself, right? De la Vega similarly seems to have a conception of philosophy, at least through the figure of the philosopher, as someone who is just deeply immersed in scholastic logic without naming any names, and then is also widely read in mostly the same ancient authors Gassendi reads, right? Like, for example, Tertullian and Athenaeus and so on. Not necessarily works of philosophy, but works that show that you are erudite, that you're well read. That's the caricature I get from him. Other than that, he doesn't really represent a school of thought. But he is less of a buffoon than philosophers were often represented as being in 17th century comedy.
All right, so I've got another question about the relationship between coinage on the one hand and stocks and derivatives.
Oh yeah.
On the other, we've been talking a lot about coins, how their value is greater than the value of the metal that makes them up. How once you've got them, you can have loans at interest that allow value to proliferate without any bounds. So, do you think is there a difference in kind between the demon conjuring properties of the second order financial instruments?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that that the ducaton is in the first instance a coin, right? And that I think goes back to 16th century Spain. But the interesting thing about the ducaton share speculators is that this becomes entirely disconnected from the coin itself, right? And indeed, this seems to me to be the key discovery of the moment, that you can, I mean, that you don't need to ground it in the metal object at all in order to start conjuring value, right? I don't know if that answers the question.
I have a question about just how confusing the confusions are. I hesitate to ask them knowing that Daniel Schiffman is sitting behind me. He's a real economist and historian. But on one level, so I'll just ask the question and then you could translate it if I'm misunderstanding. On one level, derivatives, sort of the second order financial instruments seem very confusing. But at a highest level of abstraction, they're not that confusing after all if they're kind of a way of risk management. So it's like a derivative is like just buying insurance. It's a form of
Right.
insurance. And then it seems not mysterious. You're not really conjuring. There's no specter of anything. You're just insuring, in this case, a policy, or you're insuring a stock. And so this kind of I'm trying to deflate or demystify what would be. Is this really? Does it require really that heavy of speculation about how can this be that we're conjuring this value out of nothing? But that's kind of what all insurance is about.
Sure, yeah.
It's about sharing risk and who wants to assume risk and who doesn't.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And wait, I'm sorry, a version of the question is it really that confusing? Is it really that perplexing? But I may be misunderstanding derivatives.
No. I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's an actual conjuration of demons. No. But just speaking for De La Vega, because these methods are new, and there is, again, this is really the era in which, in works like Ian Hacking's Emergence of Probability, to cite an old classic, this is the era in which simple bookkeeping developed into something much more complex, that if you look at someone like Leibniz, then gives people a method for controlling the future, or feeling epistemically in charge of the direction things are headed in, right? That's one way to put it. But obviously it's not perfect, right? And obviously you don't fully know how things are going to turn out. So it seems to me that that what De La Vega is noticing is that even in the face of this uncertainty, and that's all we mean by confusion, just not being able to see the future clearly, even in the face of this uncertainty, you can get creative with your instruments so that things will kind of come out in your favor, or so people think, right? Even if they're often ruined by it. That seems to be what De La Vega is responding to, and it of course you can demystify it, but all I'm trying to do is, so to speak, conjure back a bit of the flavor of why De La Vega thinks it's worth comparing to mystifying entities like specters.
We're at about halfway through, but Daniel, did you want to weigh in on
just a brief comment? I can't really speak to the types of derivatives that existed back then in Amsterdam. I'm just not familiar with it. And I'm not an expert in derivatives, but I can only say, as an economic historian, that the derivatives that you describe are simple and understandable, and you can demystify them. The problem is what happens when we create derivatives that are so complicated that those who created them don't really understand them. And that's exactly what happened in the lead up to the global financial crisis of 2009. That we could no longer even understand what what the derivative is, and then people said,
Right.
I don't know what I'm holding. I got to get rid
Right.
of this right away. And then we
Right,
had a
right.
panic because of the
Right,
lack
right.
of transparency. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was thinking about mentioning in addition to the crypto collapse, I was thinking about mentioning the 2008 crisis, because this is, the moment when shorts became, something that affected hundreds of millions of people personally. I think indeed it would be interesting to imagine a 2008 version of a dialogue between the accionista and the philosopher, when the philosopher is being a naive fool. The shareholder could no longer say, oh, no, I'll tell you how it works, right? In 2008, it would be more like yeah, no, none of us know how this works. And that is, again, as I put it about De La Vega's work, yet another whole nother layer of complexity that De La Vega cannot see, because he's not thinking about AI assisted investment strategies and things like that. Obviously, even Leibniz couldn't anticipate AI-assisted investment. In the end, I think Leibniz is a lot smarter than De La Vega, or a lot more important in the history of philosophy, even if De La Vega has something to offer too.
Quick question. Which financial crises or collapses of bubbles did De La Vega personally experience? I mean, I know he was only at 42 years. But
yeah.
Anything made for his lifetime?
There was a very important financial crisis in 1672, and that was not directly tulips. I don't know the details of the 72 financial crisis, but basically, what I know is that the 30 Years' War, which was, I think, 1621 to 1648, basically made the Amsterdam Stock Exchange practically defunct, and then from 1648 until 1672, it was kind of regaining its health, and presumably De La Vega was watching things happen in real time in 1672 and became sensitive to the the uncertainty of it all. And indeed, when De La Vega says that he has won and lost fortunes 5 times, 1672 could be one of them. Now, there's another stock market collapse after he dies in 1720, and this is what produces this other document that I'd like to study more, called Het Grote Tafereel der Dwaasheid, which is like the great table, or the great tablet of folly, which is a massive kind of satirical lampooning of the conceits of investors, that is supposed to also be kind of trenchant in a kind of philosophical and conceptual sense. This is something that Arthur Cole, the De La Vega scholar, has also worked on, and I'm going to get to that eventually.
What language is it?
The Great Table is in Dutch.
Oh, and Cole worked on it. Why work on it again?
Just because he was an economic historian, and I'm a historian of philosophy, and it's been 75 years. And I think I'll notice something new.